everyone. It's much nicer today, so let's keep going. We're doing 3 weeks where we're looking at the notion of prophetic critique as a powerful way that Christians can channel their energy and their hope in dark times. And last week, I started by talking about the early church. And there we see in the apocalyptic text, the book of Revelation, critique of power and critique of economic exploitation, critique of empire, a very, very strong critique, and offering a counter view at the end, a world in which food, healing, community is open to everybody. Now, one of the things about that is that is a text that is reflecting Christian critique of non-Christians, people who are actively against them. Well, as I think you know, by the time once we get to around 313, then we only have Christian emperors and a new problem emerges. What do you do if the person in power is claiming to be Christian and they act inappropriately, right? That becomes a different kind of problem. And it's one that beginning with the late antique church, I'm going to start in the 4th century, going all the way to the medieval church, that they try to work out in various different ways. So I'm going to talk about that today, this development of the notion of prophetic responsibility as the medieval church develops, and it develops in a range of ways. And then next time, and I'll remind you of this at the end, next time I'm going to be talking about, okay, well, what if you don't have special people in your community anymore? You don't have priests, you don't have monks, right? It's just all of us, priesthood of all believers. Then where does prophetic responsibility lie? And then we'll look at the example of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So just a little outline to remind you where we've been, where we are today, and where we're going. Okay, so as I said, once the emperor converts and Christianity becomes the religion of the Roman Empire, a new problem appears, right? This is ostensibly a Christian ruler, and in the minds of ancient Christians, these Christian emperors have been chosen by God to rule over a Christian empire. But power corrupts and rulers act inappropriately. So you start to have these tensions between members of the church, bishops, and imperial power. So one of the most famous events happens in the year 390 between the Olympics in Milan. So we're starting in Milan as well. Beginning in 286, Milan actually became the administrative center of the church and of empire, and you started to have the church offices there. And then also you have an imperial residence there. So in Milan, there's a bishop named Ambrose. And at that time, a figure named Theodosius I, he's really well known for the Theodosian Code, which gives us a lot of Christian law codes. It's one of the earliest fully developed Christian law codes, etc. But what ends up happening is that he's the bishop in Milan, but over in Thessaloniki, there is a tension. That basically, like, Rome is occupying everybody, right, is occupying Greece. And in Thessaloniki, a local Roman commander arrests a popular charioteer, right? Sports are political, just like people try to politicize sports, and the Olympics, in a way, politicizes and depoliticizes sports. But sports were an important, obviously sociocultural, but also political aspect of ancient culture. And so there oftentimes culture clashes would get played out in sporting events. So I have a student right now who's actually we're going to Rome over spring break, and he's doing his paper on how the early Roman empires used gladiators and the popularity of gladiators for their political program, right? Let's bring the NFL winning Super Bowl team to the White House, that kind of idea, right? So the more things change, the more they stay the same. So everybody's rioting, everybody's upset, and the commander, local Roman commander, gets killed in a riot. And in order to punish the people of Thessaloniki for that, when they are next time that they are in the games, Theodosian, the emperor, seals the arena and massacres everybody. in the arena. 7,000 to 15,000 people. Well, this is obviously, even by ancient standards, a horrific massacre and bloodbath. Here, just on his whim, he's trapping people, he's massacring them. And so Ambrose speaks out about this. He's the Bishop of Milan. This is where one of the imperial palaces is. And he basically writes to Theodosius and says, this is a grave sin. You can't just do whatever you want. I'm essentially going to excommunicate you. You cannot enter the church. You cannot take Eucharist, right? And you can't do that until you do public penance. You can't just do whatever you want. You may be a Christian emperor, but you cannot do whatever you want. And so this is one of the first times that we see a bishop taking a principled stand against power, but specifically against a Christian emperor, right? So you have this kind of power struggle. And later medieval accounts refer to this story endlessly, right? It's a real historical event that happened, but it also takes on a life of its own. And you get these big, elaborate, dramatic accounts of the story. So the details are probably, when we get to this, I'll tell you now what happens next, are probably dramatized, but it is historically accurate. So several church historians preserve the story that eventually Theodosius comes to the cathedral in Milan. Ambrose meets him at the door and says, you can't come in. So the emperor withdraws. And then a few months later, right, he wants his soul to be saved. He wants to have the moral authority of the church behind him. So he returns barefoot. He's wearing, sackcloth and ashes, and he publicly repents. Now, this is one instance, but it really becomes a flashpoint, a turning point for thinking about power. How does the church rebuke not a pagan, not a heathen emperor, but an emperor a person in power who is Christian, or is at least claiming to be Christian? And so this becomes a specific story that is used time and time again by 12th century, 13th century, later people to say this is the seed of the church's responsibility, because we're talking about prophetic responsibility, to speak truth to power, even if that person is within your own tradition, right? And it might look bad that you're having a Christian emperor engaged in public penance like that. So they never forget this image of a bishop stopping the emperor at the church door and saying, no, you can't. Your power does not give you right of entry here. You, in matters of morality, in matters of sin, you do not have any power. You cannot do just whatever you want. You cannot just act with impunity. You are going to be called to justice, right? Because that's the thing about power. People just start to act with impunity and do whatever they want, and they aren't called to account. And so how do you call people to account? How do you do that? This is a long time struggle. So here we have this quintessential example, which was a historical event that happened, but also becomes a centerpiece of a story. And one of the things that's fascinating is Ambrose refers to the Bible, and he refers to probably the most famous instance of prophetic critique of a king, which is Nathan criticizing David. If you think about King David, so King David, he's hanging out on his rooftop. He sees a foreign woman, Bathsheba, bathing, and he's like, I'd like to have sex with her. Well, she's married, too bad, doesn't matter. Calls her over, has sex with her, sends her back. Well, she gets pregnant. Bathsheba gets pregnant, and King David thinks, I don't want anybody to know about that. Recalls her husband in the hopes that they'll do it and it can cover up the pregnancy. But the husband is maintaining a religious vow, so he doesn't want to have sexual relations at that time. So King David says, now she's going to get caught. Now I'm going to get caught. So he then says, okay, well then you're right. You have to go to the most dangerous front in the hopes that he gets killed. And he does get killed. And Bathsheba comes and becomes David's wife. Well, that's horrific, right? That's absolutely horrific. And David is called to account, and he is punished for that. He's called to account. And so Ambrose looks to that, saying even King David has to follow God's law. Even King David is not free from rebuke from God. So he draws on a biblical example to use this example against Theodosius. So this becomes a foundational event. Well, then people have to start thinking about this. If the church is going to rebuke power, how exactly is that going to work? How is that going to look, right? Because religion and empire are very hand in hand. They're very, right? They don't have a separation of church and state. So how is this going to work? Well, you see then, as we move into the 5th century, Augustine, he writes his famous work, The City of God. And Augustine is a bishop in Northern Africa. And he reframes in this work the church as a community that must never fully identify with earthly power. What has happened is that in 410, Rome gets destroyed. Rome gets sacked. And so by the Visigoths, by heathens up in Europe. And so everyone thinks, uh-oh, what's happened, right? We're a Christian empire and these barbarians, right? Barbarians are at the gates. The barbarians have come and have sacked Rome. So this causes all sorts of turmoil. How did this happen, right? If our God's the most powerful God, why is he allowed Rome? This kind of a seat of power. How has he allowed that to happen? So he writes this book called The City of God, where he compares, he has many tasks he wants to do, but for our purposes, he's comparing the city of God with the city on earth, with earthly cities, earthly empires. And these, of course, aren't actual cities. These are conceptual communities. And he basically says that there are 2 cities, and history is not shaped by power or by empire, right? The important thing is not the triumph of any particular empire, right? Of course, he wants to say that because now we have this heathen empire who seems to be triumphant. And he has to say that's not what's important. But actually, for the church, there are always 2 cities. We live in the way that the Gospel of John says, we live in the world, but we're not of the world, right? We live in the city of Rome or powerful cities. Those are fundamentally important to us as a church community, but we are not of them. And so how does he understand these 2 cities, the city of God and earthly city? And he says, well, the city of God is ordered towards God, right? God is at the center of it, towards love and towards God. The city, the earthly cities are always ordered, are always directed towards the self and always have an aim of dominance and power. And that the church needs to separate itself out from that mission. Now, again, we can see why he's wanting to do this because they don't have Rome anymore. So they want to say, well, that's not really our city. We have a different city, right? So that's the reason why he's doing it. But it also provides the occasion for him to work out. How do we live? How does the church live here when we adopt, at least metaphorically, right, this city of God, but we're living in these earthly cities that only care about power? And he basically argues, comes up with the idea that even though the church is living in societies, it must never, ever identify itself completely with any regime, ruler, or empire. Now, this is fascinating. It's kind of an early version of church and state. If you think about it, there has to be a separation. Now, I'm not an American historian. I'm not a constitutional historian, but my limited understanding of the American idea of church and state is that we don't want the government, right? We want to have freedom of religion because we want to be able to choose what religion we are in or no religion. The government can't tell you because that's solving a problem that's happening in Europe that the Puritans were having to deal with and coming over here. So that's the purpose there of the separation. Here, the purpose of the separation is that you need to have distance in order to critique. You need to have distance. You cannot the church, the righteous cannot ever identify with power, cannot be integrated with power. You have to have, because emperors are also prone to sin, rulers, kings are prone to sin. And so you need to have a theologically distancing, this conceptual space for critique. If no earthly authority is identical with God's reign, even a Christian one, I mean, here he's obviously dealing with the Visigothian one, but even a Christian one, rulers then are morally accountable to a higher standard. So first you have this idea the church can critique power. Ambrose says, hey, you can't just massacre 15,000 people because one of your Roman commanders got killed. You know, you can't just do that. That's sinful. We're not going to let you just use your power without accountability. And then you have Augustine coming along and saying, okay, but in order to do that, we have to have some distance. The church cannot be fully identified in any way so that it can critique, not so that it can be free, but so that it can be free to critique. And that becomes fundamentally important. So he wants to remind rulers, you stand under divine judgment. And he's able to articulate more fully this idea of prophetic responsibility, one that requires distance. So then the question becomes, how do you maintain that distance, right? Bishops want power. I mean, everyone saw conclave last year, right? People want power. People, everybody wants power. So, I mean, in the medieval world, obviously being a high-level bishop or pope, that's an enormous amount of power. So the church, inherently, we have to live in earthly cities. But we have to inhabit them without being absorbed by them. We have to inhabit them without being complicit with their earthly aims. Because otherwise we can't speak truth to power. You have to have that kind of distance. So that's one way in which it starts to develop in late ancient Christianity. You have another development within Christianity that begins in antiquity, but fully starts exploding in what used to be called the Dark Ages, the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th century. And they're just called that because we don't have a lot of historical information about that period. But that's also the Carolingian period. That's the period when Christianity in the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th century, Christianity moves up into Europe, start conquering all those places. And it also is a time then where you're setting up churches and okay, so now we've conquered this Visigothian area. There's kings, there are rulers there. The bishops there have to set up relationships with people there. Okay, well, we're conquering Gaul. We're moving up into Scandinavia. We have to set up our church and our relationships with people there. We're going to have bishops there, just like we do now, right? We have the bishop of this city, the bishop of that city, right? So that kind of thing starts to happen. And what ends up happening in this period of time, as Christianity moves up into Europe, starts conquering all of Europe, and starts establishing churches and episcopates in these big major cities in Europe, the bishops start becoming entangled in power. It just happens. So even though Augustine has set up this notion, and even though we have this of separateness, and even though we have this example of Ambrose speaking truth to power, that's the reality, right? Powerful people mix with other powerful people. We've seen that. We see that now. Powerful people that you might think, how do they know each other? Because they're all in the circles of power. So powerful people mix with powerful people. And so you start to see bishops serving as imperial administrators, diplomats, political actors. They want to have proximity with power, right? There's this kind of power negotiation that's always happening. And so into that space, then you start to see the monastic movement turn its eyes towards not just secular rulers, but also Christian leaders, bishops. So monasticism starts to develop in the 3rd century. You start to get the actual, that's mostly desert monasticism. You get monasteries, right, where people are actually living in community as opposed to alone in the desert. You start getting that in the 300s and the 400s. And then monasticism, it significantly develops, and you evolve the different monastic movements and they start to develop. Well, how do monastics run themselves? They have rules, right? So you might have heard of a monastic rule or the Benedictine rule or the rule of Basil, right? You might have heard of these kinds of rules, and they're just basic rules: when to pray, when to eat, never be alone. All these, you can be alone, but you can't be with just 2 people because they don't want any sexy activity. So you always have to have Although you can have sexy activity with 3 people, but they don't go that far. So yes, we can't. Yes, they have all these kind of rules, right? And monasteries are they start to develop an enormous amount of power. And what you start to see is that Benedict, a church father who develops the Benedictines, right? He becomes the founder of a new monastic movement. He basically says, listen, we've withdrawn from society. We've renounced earthly power. We've renounced money. We've renounced sexuality and family life. We've withdrawn, right? We're not like the bishops who are, believe me, many priests and bishops are married, right? This becomes a thing in the medieval period. They're married. They are also working as political diplomats, right? As the church becomes more powerful, as the Christian emperor becomes Holy Roman Emperor, right? Then we start to have this kind of unholy union between the leaders of the church who want power and Europe and the Holy Roman Emperor. Well, so into this space, then Benedict comes along and says, no. Where is prophetic power going to come then? Because these people, these church leaders, they're seeming to want power as well, right? Where you don't have the church is not full of Ambroses, right? It's full of people who are trying to curry power, get a benefit for their monastery, whatever, right? Curry favor with leaders. So Benedict, in his rule, he specifically argues that as men who have renounced property, status, marriage, and political ambition, we are generating a new kind of credibility. So if Ambrose thought, well, I have the credibility of Christ, right? I have the credibility of the prophet Nathan, who's critiquing power. Well, what do you do when those bishops themselves become embroiled in those power games? Credibility has to be generated from somewhere else. So you start to get this credibility being generated through the monastic movement. They've stepped aside from wealth, warfare, patronage, right? Patronage is a huge thing. And so monks, they embody a very different kind of social order, right? They engage in prayer. They don't have earthly ambitions. They espouse and try to live their lives in situations of humility and submission rather than dominance and power. As a community, they decide to make things through communal discernment, decision-making, meetings, right? Things like that, rather than dominance and control from the top. And over time, he recognizes this generates its own kind of moral authority, right? You have nothing to gain, you have nothing to lose, right? But you can come from a position, somebody who's renounced power, you can therefore see the sin or the manipulation because you have nothing to gain, you have nothing to lose. They're outside of that society. So there you have this notion, whereas Ambrose is working within that closed system of the Roman Empire and the relationship with the church. Ambrose was trying to critique from within, right? Monks are stepping outside of all of these people, right? Monks have their credibility is generated not from their office, that they're ordained bishop, but from their actual moral living. And so since bishops risk compromise through their closest to rulers, monks claim this kind of clarity through their withdrawal from that kind of life. So you see, for example, throughout this 8th, 9th century, you start to see monastic figures writing to kings saying, you're not acting right. I don't care what the local bishop told you. These decisions are wrong. You're misusing your power. You need to give more money to the poor, right? And they're generating this because they're not gaining anything from it. They're not. And so this generates a kind of morally grounded counsel that flows from lives intentionally disentangled from power. So here we start to see this idea that the people who can speak truth to power are not necessarily other powerful people. And the reason why that is because other powerful people also want power, right? They also want power, and they're willing to overlook all kinds of things that will get them access to power, that will get them in to power. So that becomes a major, you start to have monastic critique of power. not through official channels, but through, just looking at time, not through official channels, but through this monastic critique. Well, the next big kind of official change that starts to happen happens in the 11th century. And here we're back to ecclesial officers. That basically Pope Gregory the Seventh, he basically wants to say these ideas that are floating around, I want to put them into ecclesial law. I want to make these modes of critique of power, I want to make this an ecclesiastical principle, not just a theological idea of distance that he is able to develop from Augustine's City of God, right? That we have to be distant, not just this historical example, which he quotes as being a defining example of Ambrose, right? And we can't just rely on charismatic monks who are outside of the system, because to some extent they can be people don't know them as well. They're not positions of power. Right? These are people who have given up power, given up their names, right? All those kinds of things. So how can the church, with all of its power, how can we actually turn that into an ecclesial position that we need to rebuke? So basically what ends up happening is there's a lot of reform, and this is in the 11th century, so the 1000s. Gregory the Seventh is he's pope from 73 to 84 of the 1073 84. And basically what starts happening is you just see there's all kinds of corruption, right? This is kind of corruption that eventually explodes in the Protestant Reformation. But basically there's the sin of simony, which you may have heard, and that's the buying and selling of offices, right? So if I'm a local priest, I want to be a bishop, I raid the coffers of my church to give some money to the emperor so that I can be made bishop, so I can be made archbishop, so I can be made cardinal or something like that. Clerical marriage, right? That many priests were being married, having several women, having clerical families, wanting the church to support their families. So that was, there was a lot of problems with official priests. And also the notion, and so all of this connects to, he saw all of this as being a problem of what he calls lay investiture. Who gets to decide who are the priests? Who gets to pick the next archbishop? Who gets to pick the pope? Right? So we just had Pope Leo. Seems like a good guy. So we just had who gets to pick him? Well, before Gregory, the emperor essentially got to pick. I mean, that wasn't technically the case, but technically, I mean, it was all money changing hands, favors being done, absolution from sin being offered, all kinds of things were being offered in the buying and selling of offices. And so this comes to a controversy. It's called the investiture controversy. Can kings choose their bishops who are going to be on their side? And right, they need this for moral persuasion. Right, once you have the bishops, they're going to control the priests, which control. How do people in villages, in towns, and small cities, right? They get their guidance from their ministers, from their priests, from their local bishops. Right, their lives are controlled by far off forces, but these are the local kinds of leaders. So he ends up having a conflict with Henry IV during the investiture controversy. And he basically takes these previous ideas that if kings control church appointments, who's going to be a bishop, episcopal appointments, then they're beholden to royal favor, right? He just says you can't do that. It's simply what was happening just as a matter of course, and then you're hoping people are going to be an Ambrose and be able to speak truth to the person who appointed them. They're not, right? You can see they're not. Once you're in the circles of power, it becomes very hard to speak truth to power. So structurally, this is a problem because all the bishops in Europe owe their appointments to the emperor. So to the Holy Roman Emperor. So this is going to be a problem. So he develops this idea, and he writes a document. It's called Dictatus Papae, right? So basically popes, right? So how are you going to get popes? And he crystallizes this logic. And so he says, no, popes should be able to depose emperors. Emperors should not be able to depose popes, right? That we are here. Part of our job is to critique earthly power. We inhabit. So we cannot in any way be beholden to secular authorities, secular rulers. Again, he draws on these biblical precedents and of King David and these historical examples of Ambrose. And basically, part of this was that he wants to, in a way, he recognizes and he wants to relieve this weird pressure that bishops are under, that they get appointed by somebody who has secular power, and then they want to keep their job, right? They want to keep their job. And I mean, these are jobs, these are men, they have families at this point. They not later, but they did. And they want to keep their job. So how are they going to speak truth to power? So in a way, he wants to relieve that pressure. That's an actual real world pressure on them. He wants to cleanse them of sin, right? Once a secular person is involved in choosing the office, you can bribe them. It's not that you can't bribe a pope, but if you're living in poverty, what are they going to do with the money, right? They can't do anything with it. So he wants to put this into law. So he does excommunicate, because Henry's refusing to go along with this. He excommunicates Henry. Henry eventually does penance and is let back into the church. And this actually becomes, at the Concordat of Worms later on, this actually becomes into ecclesial law, that secular rulers, with the reasoning that we have to be able to speak truth to power. Now, this is a Protestant church here, and so we know that that kind of stuff continued, right? You can change the laws, but the reality is that kind of work continues, where you have people under the table. They're not doing it obviously now, but they're trying to curry favor in various different ways. The buying of indulgences. Oh, so now you can't buy an office, but now you can buy indulgences, which is that you can pay money to get monks to pay for you, to get priests to pay for you. So you don't have to spend all that nasty time praying for yourself in order to get rid of your sin and things like that. So you have indulgence. So all this corruption still kind of continues. So what you start to see then is, once again, the monastic movement gets into gear. And so you start to see the rise even more, right? Because things change over time. Prophetic movements have a lot of cultural influence, or monastic movements, and then it kind of dies away and then they come back. And so in the 12th century, you start to have really people who, to some extent, are essentially nobodies. Nevertheless, they're within the monasteries and within the cloisters. They are feeling like they can speak truth to power. So one of the most famous examples is Hildegard of Bingen. A lot of people know about her. She's written a lot of beautiful hymns. She's absolutely wonderful. Hildegard of Bingen. She's a cloistered abbess, right? She's not a bishop. She's not an ecclesiastical ruler, right? She's not anything like that. But she feels like she develops this notion of prophetic responsibility, that she sees that the emperor is not acting right, and that she can write and speak truth to power, and that she's not going to get crushed. And why does she have authority? Because she's devoted her life to God. She's written about her visions, and people are moved by the power of her visions. And because of those visions, people feel that she, because of her monastic life, that she's deeply close to God. She has an enormous amount of personal charisma because she's been able to choose the life that she lives. She explicitly understands her work as prophetic. How can I channel the moral credibility that I've generated, the closeness that I feel with God through my visions? How can I channel that with confidence to speak against the world in ways that other people can't, because they aren't living this kind of life, right? They have too much to lose. That's why people don't speak truth to power. It's uncomfortable. They have a lot to lose. We'll be talking about that notion of costly grace next time, but she's able to do that. Another example is Bernard of Clairvaux. He becomes incredibly influential. He's also a monk who rebukes the Pope for worldliness. He denounces ecclesiastical luxury. He denounces bishops for living lives of luxury. And you start to see in this 12th century, not just critique of power, but critique of society. That's what starts to happen in the 13th century. So far, we've just seen this as being, how do you criticize those who are at the top? How do you criticize the person who is in power, especially when part of his power is entangling every other powerful person into this web of power and exchange and money and favors and connections and offices, right? How do you do that? But it's always been about those people who are in power. What you start to see in the 12th century, and what I'm going to end with in a minute, but what you start to see in the 12th century is people saying, well, we're not just criticizing people in power. The example is not just the prophet Nathan criticizing David for abusing his power. Prophets critique society, right? It's not just that there's somebody at the top. What's happened to our society such that we're producing such people? What's happened to our society such that we're not only producing such people, but we are valorizing them by giving them power, and that we're tolerating this fundamental misuse of power? So you start to see him say, I'm not just critiquing power, I'm also critiquing the way our society has developed, and the way, therefore, then the church has developed, that we become fully identical with society. You can't tell the difference, he said, when you're walking down the street between somebody who's a Christian or not, how they're living. They're just as concerned with wealth. They're just as concerned with status. They're just as concerned with ambition. Right. And so we need to actually engage in a prophetic critique of society. And that was part of the prophetic critique. You can go around living your life in the Bible, right? Amos speaks to this. Isaiah speaks to this. Micah speaks to this. You can go around living your life and be, going to temple, making the right sacrifices, being observant, praying. You can be doing all those kinds of things that all seems technically correct. But if you are tolerating and living in and benefiting from an unjust society, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. And Jesus says that as well in the very famous parable of the rich man and Lazarus, right? Where you've got the rich man, he's super rich, he's super wealthy, he's super faithful. And then there's Lazarus, who's a poor beggar covered with sores outside his gate. And when they both die, Lazarus goes up to be in Abraham's bosom up in heaven, and the rich man is down in hell. And the rich man's like, but I was so faithful. I was so, I love Moses. I love David. I love God. Right? And they're just like, oh, well, okay, but you didn't listen. You didn't listen. And he's like, okay, well, go tell my brothers, go tell my family, because I don't want them to suffer the way that I'm suffering. And Jesus basically says, why should I do that? We have told you. We've told you a million times. It's in the Bible. What's once more gonna, what's one more? One of my favorite details of that story is when the rich man is in heaven and he's burning and he's so thirsty. He says, oh, Lazarus, could you bring me some water? And God says, there's a chasm between us. I'm not going to bring you any water. But he's so used to just getting what he wants. Can't even see how against God's law this is. So you start to see in the 12th century people like Hildegard of Bingen and Bernard of Clairvaux, that they're not just critiquing power, although they're doing that, they're slightly moving it to critique society as well. And that really explodes with what comes to be called, right, the mendicant movements in the 1200s, the most famous of which is St. Francis, right? People begin to see that even powerful abbots, right? Leaders of monks, right? Monasteries become institutions that are inherently wealthy. People give a bunch of money to monasteries. People put their money there for safekeeping, all kinds of things. And, monks themselves sometimes get involved in power. So you have movements like the movements of the Dominicans and the movements of the Franciscans begin in the 13th century, where they are continuing this critique of society. And they're doing it by living publicly, so everybody can see the difference. So with St. Francis, right, he's not just sitting in his monastery. He's in the marketplace. He's out in public. He's living his values. So too with Dominic. So St. Francis of Assisi, he doesn't just live a life of poverty. in his monastic cell. He's out in the street. He's showing you, I don't have shoes. He's showing you, I'm leading a life of impoverishment and love and, sister, sun, brother, sun, sister, moon, right? Did you guys grow up watching that in the 70s or whatever that came out in the 60s? Right, he's actually doing that. So in a world, he's doing it in the economic centers of Italy. And he's basically saying, in a world that's transformed by money, by trade, by rising economic inequality, he wants his very being to be a prophetic rebuke, not just to power, right? Thinking about kings and people of power and in control over society, but everybody who's benefiting in some way from this system, everybody who's benefiting. And he's saying it's not private spirituality. It's not just withdrawing into a monastery, right? You need to demonstrate this. This is a visible critique, a visible rebuke of a church and a society that is not just serving those who are interested in dominion, coercion, power, but the way in which that has resulted in a society that's obsessed with ambition, wealth, money, trade, and so on. So he wants to be out there publicly displaying it, not just in his own community. And as an example, a final example, in the 13th century, you have Dominic, the Dominicans, and they come to be known as the preaching friars. And he basically says, listen, we can't just be waiting for people to come to us. We have to go to them. Poor people are working. Poor people are living in the streets. Poor people are struggling. We can't just be sitting in our fancy cathedrals. We can't just be sitting in our fancy churches and be like, oh, come on here. Everybody come here once a week. We can't be doing that. We need to go into the streets. We need to go into the squares. We need to go in the dark alleys. We need to go in the highways and the hedges and the byways and the alleys. That's what we need to do. We need to live among the poor. You can't rebuke power if you're living in a fancy house or a fancy monastery out in the country. You have to live among these people if you want to serve them. We have to preach in the marketplace. We have to challenge civic and judicial injustice, but we need to do it not just by preaching, but by how we live. In contemporary reports writing about these figures, and people in power did not like them. Right, people in the church were like, these people are dirty, they're filthy, right? But they're example of living the gospel, not just preaching the gospel, of critiquing not just power, but a society that benefits from that power, right? It's very easy to say, well, I'm not in power, I don't have any power, right? I'm just a regular person trying to live my life, raise my kids. I don't have power. But if you're benefiting, and the biblical prophets about this are clear, and the mendicant prophets are well, if you're benefiting from this unjust society, I bet a lot of people in this room are benefiting from the way our economic system is set up. I have a 401k, I'm benefiting, but you have to think through what you are called to do. Is that truly living your faith if you are benefiting from a situation that is not what Christ has said of a truly Christian society should be like, which he describes to us in the book of Revelation. So what you start to see then in this development of a notion of prophetic responsibility is first grappling with this question of, well, I understand how I speak truth to power to a heathen. How do I speak truth to power to a Christian ruler who's claiming to be Christian, et cetera? How do I do that? Secondly, okay, how do I just think about that in general terms? There has to be a distancing. You can't have a state church. You can't have a church that's allied with centers of power, because the minute you're allied with centers of power, you're going to be corrupted by it. And then you see the monastic moving saying, right, all you bishops are corrupted. And so we generate our own moral credibility by being separate, even from church systems of power. And then you have this further explosion where you say, right, but we can't just be people in power in the church who are making right decisions. We need to live amongst and like the very people that Christ has called us to serve. if we want to bring about that kingdom. So you start to see this democratization of prophetic power, right? At the time, you're like, well, you're a prophet, right? Prophet Nathan is a prophet. These bishops are in positions of power. They have access, right? It's their job. I'm a farmer. I'm a cobbler. I'm a fruit dealer, like, whatever, right? Whatever you are in the ancient world, right? These are people who are in positions of power. But starting in the 13th century with these mendicant friars, the Franciscans and the Dominicans, you start to see the emergence of this idea of the democratization of the prophetic responsibility. It's up to all of us to do that. And that idea, of course, explodes with the Protestant Reformation. What do you do when there's not just one single church? How do you democratize prophetic responsibility with the priesthood of all believers? How do you do that? And then what do we do in truly dire situations where it's really going to cost us something, in some cases our lives, to speak truth to power? And we'll look at that example of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Okay, so that's this week on prophetic responsibility. Any questions or comments or anything? Yes.
When you have a group like monks that have no power, they're outside the system, but they then speak truth to power, does it ever make any difference?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. They make all sorts of differences, right? They make differences too. I mean, Jesus is somebody who did that and he made an enormous difference, right? So charismatic figures, in fact, can be, because if you think about it, if you're going along in a society, there has to be, and it's just getting more and more and more corrupt, right? There has to be a kind of reset. So you do see the church realizing how popular the Dominicans are, how popular they are, and you do see a change. Does it then slide back, right, with more programs for the poor, more integrating, supporting those people who are doing that kind of work? Then it slides back into corruption, right? You have to be enormously vigilant. I think we can just see that in our lives. You have to be enormously vigilant against the human impulse for power, domination, ease, right? I don't want to, a lot of things are hard. I'd rather just live my comfortable life. But you do see that. If you're interested in this notion of just generally about sources of religious power and authority and how they're effective, Max Weber, he is a German sociologist of religion, and he developed a whole kind of paradigm for understanding religious power. And he talks about institutional power, right? You're obeying me because I'm at that office, and then versus what he calls charismatic authority. And he talks about, more people view charismatic authority as being much more effective and much more truthful, right? I'm obeying a cop. I don't know who that cop is. I'm obeying him because he's a cop, right? Whereas when I'm following Jesus, I don't care what his status is. I'm obeying him because I think he's morally correct. So it's that kind of division, and it is effective in bringing about change. So the power of moral leadership, and we see what happens when you don't have moral leadership. A modern person, I think, who's really working on this is Jacinda Ardern, and she has a new book out on how can you be a leader without ambition? Right? How can you be a leader without ambition? That she talks about how she didn't have any personal ambition, and so also empathy, kindness, things like that. So I think that's a model of leadership. She's teaching classes and has an institute on new forms of leadership. She's going all over Europe, having people come to think about how can you have leadership without ambition for power, control, etc.
It's funny that you posed that question, because I was going to make the alternative statement that I've been so moved over the past couple of weeks with the Venerable Monks Walk for Peace. That started in Fort Worth, Texas, and on the very first day, one of them lost their leg in an accident. A truck hit them as they just began their walk.
Yeah,
and he obviously he's okay, thank God. But not many people knew about them. But as time went on, it's been 100 days. By the time they got to Washington, D.C., there were hundreds of thousands of people following them. I'm on several of their community sites. They're teaching us about the way, Buddhist, religion thinks and acts and behaves, and we're learning so much about peace and how to bring it.
Yeah, and what are they doing? They're walking.
They're
What they're
walking.
doing publicly,
Yeah.
right? They're they're
Yeah.
what they're
Just
wearing,
walk.
what they're, just bringing. And I think, with them, it's so fun to kind of follow and see people engage with them and support them. And after that accident, try to protect them and, the help. And it just has been truly inspiring. And I think that kind of moral leadership, right? Moral service is transformative.
I feel like it's tipped the scale.
Yeah.
Honestly. I feel a lot of hope.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
This probably applies more next week, but I'm thinking about how do leaders get advice? Like I'm thinking of Billy Graham and whom do they turn to? Because we have so many different ideas about what is moral. Like at the Highlands, there's a group of women who say Biden was a terrible president because he was a terrible Catholic. Because he believed in free choice. So therefore, he was bad, period. And so how do leaders get advice when the people believe different things?
Yeah, that's true all the time, right? That's true all the time. And I think, one of the things that I think about is any kind of input that comes from outside your circle of power, people who have nothing to gain from you, right? That's why we have, independent councils, right? That's why we have those things where they say, well, we've appointed an independent person, right? Who's not beholden to, you have to have people who have nothing to gain and nothing to lose, and it's just, we don't have a very good system for that.
Well, first of all, your talk today makes me want to go back and read Chaucer's Canterbury Tales.
Yes.
But the other thing was to kind of go further with the whole monastery, monastical life thing. I always thought that they were under the power of the Roman Catholic Church, that they were, and if they were, then how could they speak out without getting retribution from the powers that be of the Roman Catholic Church?
Yeah, it is always the case.
You might bring people.
Oh, sure, yes.
People.
People are just wondering, how does monastic power work when monasteries are technically under the Pope, essentially, right? They're technically under control. And again, going back to this notion of the distinction, and this is true in all religious traditions, the distinction between clerical office, somebody who's in, because they have an office, they've been ordained, and somebody who has moral suasion because of the life that they've chosen. So yes, they are under that rule, but there's tons of rebellious monks, right? And this is always a problem. This is always a problem for people in power. What do you do when you have these, and we have church letters that are talking about these crazy black robed men, and they're talking, right? These are bishops writing to each other being like, oh my gosh, these effing monks over here causing nothing but problems by reminding me about all the poor people, right? They're so mad, right? So you do have those kinds of tension, but that's how they gain their credibility, is through having some sense of distance. They're not seeking office. They don't want anything. They don't need money, jewels, right? They're living a simple life. They don't have family that you can hurt, or who would, maybe, so they have that moral space to speak truth to power. And it's a constant thorn in the side of emperors and popes throughout the entire history of Christianity. So yes, they technically have to be obedient, but they're also like, no, you don't, I don't have to be obedient. We are of the city of God. We have the right to rebuke you, right? Of course, this is a constant power struggle, but the monastic devotion to that, to their ideal, leaves them in a position where their integrity can't be impugned, right? They're not doing it for any self-serving reason.
So that brings me to a question. I love what you said. I was thinking about just walking, recognizing our full humanity.
Yeah.
Every one of us, all the time.
Yeah.
Right. If we say I am of the city of God. There's a kind of power in that. too.
Yeah.
And that gets dangerous.
Mhm.
So maybe just walking is the best time. You know? No, I really
Yeah, but I think,
struggle with-
one of the things that I think is that, when you look at the actions that are required, obviously to some extent they're extreme, give away everything that you own, et cetera. But at some extent they're not. They're
Yeah.
feed the poor,
Right.
visit the sick, visit the imprisoned, help those who are not doing well, who are suffering under this city of Babylon, right? Right. We are living in the city of Babylon now, according to the book of Revelation, where merchants and tradespeople, businessmen are making money off of tariffs and trades and trafficking in goods and people. That's what's going on. And you have to, opt out of those systems. So the small things that we can do, right, can be things like walking, welcoming people, working at food lane, those kinds of things, and just constantly with every doing actions without, that's the whole thing. How can you critique when it's not? How can you critique? How can you behave in such a way that your behavior stands as a critique of what society has become?
Yeah,
Right.
making that verbal claim.
Yeah.
Makes me very nervous.
Yeah.
At the same, it really does, saying those words.
Yeah.
Like, well, I'm this.
Well, because also, one person I didn't talk about is, you have Savonarola. He was wanted to critique Florence,
Yes.
right? And he's just, he was a book burner. He was an insane guy, right? So that's an example of church overreach, right? Where the church then wants to dominate the city rather than, right? He's somebody he's upset that he doesn't have the power and he wants to use his power to dominate everybody in Florence and get everybody in Florence to do what he wants and be super, super Christian-y and super, super strict, right? So, he's very, very famous. So he's kind of using his prophetic authority to dominate. He's not using him. That's why he's not remembered well. That's why we don't remember him well, because he doesn't have the charismatic moral authority of Dominic or Francis, because they were not trying to dominate. They're trying to serve. They're walking the walk, right? They're doing as they say, right? They're not. So I think that it's when you think, and Savonarola was just out on fiery brimstone preaching and going out there and telling people what's what and all of that. Well, people don't like that, right? People don't like to be told what to do. And I think it's fascinating that in our very, very first gospel, the Gospel of Mark, it doesn't contain a lot of teaching. It's not about that. It's about what you do. It's not about going around saying to everybody, I'm from the city of God. You should do what you don't do that. You just go for a walk. You let everybody see what you're doing. They're not saying, they're just saying I'm walking for peace.
Actions speak louder.
Actions speak louder than words, right? And I think that, Matthew and Luke then said, well, we do need to include some of Jesus's teaching. So let's put those in. But Mark didn't seem to knew that. It's just story after story of Jesus serving and saying you have to become like, you're so interested, they're like, how can we get, the whole thing in Mark is they're all like, how do we get power? I want to sit at the right hand of the Father. Who's going to sit here? And he's like, no, be a servant, be a child, be somebody without power, be somebody without resources, and serve your community that way. So I don't think, that these guys say, well, you go around acting all puffed up like one part of the city of God, look at everything I'm doing, right? You just live that way and those eyes will come to you. Francis is preaching in the marketplace, but he's also just living there.
So thinking about what I heard you saying, sort of income inequality,
Yeah.
the poor and the rich and powerful. And somehow that moral authority has got to reach those of us who are complicit.
Mm-hmm.
We know we're complicit.
Yeah.
Like you say, we all have 401ks and that kind of thing. It's like.
Yeah, that's a big tension for me too, Meredith.
Sure.
And you're thinking of, the stocks that we live on and rely on for our well-being and the comforts that we have in our home and our families, and, that I can buy what I want at the grocery store and
Yeah.
don't have to worry about price, but what does that really mean and at what
Mhm.
cost for others? And I struggle with that.
So me,
That could be
me
a
as
hundred-
well, right? And I want my children, you know, I would send my kids to the best schools they could get into, right? You know what I mean? I'm living in this world too. It's very hard to live in the world and not be of the world, which is, you know, what John counsels us to do. It's very hard to do that. So I do think every year, frankly, I do think about that, and, you know, especially around tax time. And I try to think, you know, you know, next week we will be talking about what Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and he's not talking specifically about money, but he uses the language of money where he talks about cheap grace and costly grace.
But it would
You know,
seem-
what is it costing you in terms of actually costing you? Like how much of your wealth are you hoarding, you know? And of course, I'm hoarding my wealth, what little wealth, I mean, I'm a humanities professor, I don't. But compared to the world, I do, right? But I'm hoarding it for my children. Well, my children, of course, my children are more important to me. They're not more important though than anybody else's children. They're not more important than the children in Gaza, right? But it's hard for me to be like, right, I'm going to give all my money away to them because I want my children to have the benefit because I love them. It's a biological imperative to protect them, to want to give them, you know, it's hard, right? You know, but I think the first step is struggling with it and realizing it. The thing of the people who, if you read in the actual prophetic text of the Bible, as I said, these people are all just like, but they're shocked. They're like, but we're so, you know, we're so great. We're such great Jews. Like, what are you talking about? We love, we're so, and he's like, yeah, but you're not living. You're not living. You know, you're not welcoming the stranger, which is a huge thing in the Hebrew Bible. The immigrant, welcoming the outsider, welcoming the stranger. You're not doing those things. You're not doing those things. So at least I mean, Jesus takes it even further, give up everything you own. In the Bible, though, it's much more, you know, the Hebrew Bible has a much more balanced view, and then Jesus makes it pretty radical. Sure. Last question.
I'm just thinking that it would be a hard sell to tell rich people they should be poor.
Yeah. Oh, of course, and this has been going on forever, right? I mean, you have fourth century sermons on this. You know, just like, you know, Jesus, Paul says he wishes everybody were celibate. Well, that's going to be a hard sell. It's going to be a hard sell. You know, it's going to be a hard sell. You know, and so they all start saying, okay, well, if I engage in radical self-impoverishment, which is what Jesus says, well, then that money is going to other people. And aren't I making it so that they're going to be wealthy then? And then they're not going to get into heaven? How nice is that? Right. So, you know, obviously all these kinds of conundrums. And so I don't think that I don't think the Bible calls us to perfection. Right. You have that kind of notion in Arianist movements in the 3rd century that you have to be perfect. And Augustine, you know, people give Augustine a bad rap because of the original sin thing and everything like that, but which was a bummer. But theological idea to develop. But he also, you know, writes very movingly about, we think of the notion of penance as like a punitive thing, but it was actually meant to be a liberatory thing, right? Because the church is trying to figure out, well, what if you do sin? What if you do, you know, the Romans come knocking on your door and you burnt some books because you're, oh, here the, you know, I'm a biblical, I mean, I have 1,000 Bibles in my home. And if the, you know, if the people are going to kill me, I'm like, okay, here you go. Right. I don't have it within me. I don't have it within me to be a martyr. Right. And so then people were out, right? There's no allowance for the human side. And so the church starts to develop and this notion of penance which I think is a real you know, it then became like punishment and public and shame and everything like that. But what it really meant was like, yes, we all fall short. And that is going to be, you know, and that in fact, you know, I think is actually a nice thing about the Catholic Church is that they structurally have a way. You know, Protestants do too, have ways to ask God directly for forgiveness, but there's something about this kind of structure. It's just expectation. You're going to be sinning all the time. So why don't you come every week and just confess those sins and you can liberate yourself from them. And, you know, and it forces you to reflect on them in some way. The idea that the priest is the one who's absolving you rather than God, but he's a conduit from that. But I think that they recognized, right? It's a lot of these are hard. People are not going to be perfect, right? But I don't think God requires that. And I don't even think the church requires that, right? At least the Catholic Church didn't, right? I mean, that's one of the things that happens with Protestant churches. And that's why you get Puritanism, where they're not doing anything fun and they're all, because they're trying to create a structure where they won't sin. It's not a great way to live. There's a lot of joy and beauty and pleasure in the world. And I don't think, God created the world. He wants us to take pleasure in our lives and in who we are. But, and he doesn't require perfection. He does require reflection, constant rebalancing, constantly thinking, constantly moving forward.
Thank you.
All right, that's a good way to end. Thank you.